Hello, everyone. Good to be here tonight again. Between cross-country trips and last month having 5 Tuesdays, we've only had a couple of sessions in the last couple of months, almost month and a half or something. So it's good to be back tonight. This is session 27, and it's June the 6th, D-Day, 2026. No matter how many D-Days go by, I always have to watch some. What's that? What did I say? Something wrong?
I think you said 2026.
Did I say 2026? But I got D-Day right. So that's the main thing that was on my mind. So we are in Matthew 25, and something really interesting about Matthew 25. First of all, it is a very interesting chapter. There is a great variety of opinions about the various parts. There's three main parts to it. The first two parts are parables, which is kind of interesting. I mean, you look at Matthew 24, and it's just, direct statements. Not much symbolic language or anything like that, just kind of fact after fact, event after event. But you get to 25, which is a continuation of the same sermon on the same place, the Mount of Olives, by the same person, Jesus. And suddenly he reverts back to parables again, like he did earlier in his ministry. And I've tried to figure out why parables in this setting. His disciples are there. Often he would use parables when there was a mixed group, so that a parable would reinforce truth to his disciples. So they would kind of understand the parables, but sometimes they ask him later to explain the parable. But those who were not his disciples, they didn't know what the parable meant most of the time. So it was a way to teach his disciples when there was a mixed multitude around him. He could continue his teaching ministry, and yet those who were not receiving him would still be somewhat confused as to what the parable would mean. So it was just a really fascinating teaching tool. But here it's only his disciples. So it just seems a little puzzling why he would revert to parables in such an intimate setting, sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking at the city and the temple. Why didn't he just speak plainly? And I think part of the reason is, a parable has a little bit of a mystery aspect to it. And it's almost like he wanted some things that would take place after his return to still have a little bit of a mystery to them. Some of these things in this chapter are revealed in later writings, like in Paul and John and others. But for some reason at this point, he wanted a little bit of a mystery aspect to be retained regarding what will happen after his return. My goal before last session was to use one session for the entire chapter. And then I realized there's too much information, so I decided the virgins, 10 virgins in one lesson, and then the rest of the chapter in another. Well, what I've come to realize, and I've kind of repented, it kind of convicted me, is I was guilty of what I have done throughout my whole ministry, and what almost everybody I read after or listen to regarding Matthew 24 and 25, what almost all of us do. We recognize it is one unit. It really shouldn't even have a chapter division. It's one continuing lesson or sermon. And he's just moving right through the tribulation time. And then in chapter 24, verses 29 to 31, he gets to his return and our gathering to him. And then he, in 25, he moves right into what takes place after that. So chapter 25 should be seen as what takes place after 24:31. So there's kind of a time order there. You know, we did in Matthew 24, we did these time stamps, like in 24:15, when you see the abomination, then verse 21, then there shall be great tribulation. So it's like, when this happens, then this happens. And then you get down to verse 29, then immediately after the tribulation, another time stamp, verse 30, then the sign of the Son of Man, and verse 31, he'll send his angels to gather his elect. So it's, you know, it's he's taken us through that last 7 years. And chapter 25 is then what happens after that. So you have 24:31, the gathering of his elect to him. And then 3 major things are highlighted in chapter 25. And so before we get into the details of the parable of the talents, let's step back a little bit. What takes place after 24:31? Well, he wants to highlight 3 things. Number 1, a marriage is going to take place. That's the 25, 1 through 13, the 10 virgins. Another major thing that will happen immediately after his return is the parable of the talents, meaning judgment of individuals for rewards, for positions and rewards based on their service to him. That will happen at the beginning of the millennial. Then another thing that will happen at the beginning of that 1,000 years, starting at verse 31, the sheep and the goat judgment. Many people make this also a parable, but I don't. I think it's a literal judgment at a specific time of a specific people, not really worded in parable form. But be that as it may, a marriage will take place, a judgment of individuals will take place, and he will deal with the nations, those who enter the millennial in their natural bodies, is how I'm going to present the judgment of the sheep and the goats. Because there will be a large number of people who survive the tribulation and the battle of Armageddon. We really don't know for sure. Reading through Revelation, it seems like maybe, 2/3 of Israel are going to be killed. 1/3 will survive. Many people make 2/3 or 3/4 of the entire population of the earth die during the Great Tribulation. It's kind of hard to add all of them up properly in Revelation, but it does talk about 1/3 in one place and talks about a multitude in other places. But I think the 2/3, 1/3 probably holds all the way through. 2/3 of Israel will die, 2/3 of the world will die, 2/3 of the saints will die, and 1/3 will survive. In each of those 3 groups, I think 1/3 will survive. And then what's the Lord going to do with them upon his return? Well, he's going to gather that 1/3 of his saints, if it is 1/3, in a rapture. The resurrection will be those who have already died through the ages, which is the vast, probably 95% of that entire group. And then he's going to deal with that 1/3 of Israel that survives, bring them in natural bodies. That's a future lesson that Sister Ruth has been asking me about a little bit. They will be redeemed as a nation, but not resurrected in glorified bodies. They will not die. They survive. 1/3 survives. And then what is he going to do with the 1/3 of the world's population that might survive? And I think Matthew 23 addresses those 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in some way. So if you look at it in an overall sense that way, it makes more sense. But back to the mistake I make that almost everybody makes. We accept that Matthew 24 and 25 is one continuing sermon, bringing us through the tribulation into the millennium. Chapter 25 is how he sets up the operation of his kingdom for 1,000 years. So that's another way to look at Matthew 25. But the mistake we all make is when we say we're going to look at both chapters or study or preach or teach on both chapters, we'll spend 90% of our time and effort on chapter 24. And they kind of skim over chapter 25, maybe just hitting a few highlights. One reason for that is it's really just three large parts to it. So it's easier to skim through it and say, okay, this virgins mean this, the talents mean this, the judgment of the nations mean that, and just kind of deal with it briefly, not get into much detail. But I think the other reason why a lot of us kind of skim over chapter 25 is because there's a lot in there that's difficult to interpret properly. And the frustration I have always had, and I'm sure I'm guilty of this, is that, say you're dealing with the parable of, or you're dealing with the judgment of the nations, the sheep and the goats. And you study and think about it, you run cross references, you try to figure it all out on your own. So you have kind of a good handle on it, but there's parts of it that I just don't quite know how I should apply that part. So then you start, well, maybe some others have had the same problem. You go look on the internet, or you go whatever commentaries you might have, or call some other pastor brother on the phone, or email them. And what do you think about that? Then you get their feedback. But a lot of times when you go looking, they've done the same thing you've done. They deal with about 90% of it, but they really don't deal with the part that is stumping you because it stumps them too. So they just kind of gloss over it, go on to something that's a little easier to understand. And we've all been guilty of that. So my point is this. The Lord convicted me to deal with each of the three sections, one lesson each, because there is plenty in each for us to look into. Plus, another reason I decided to do this way is because I recognize those who watch it on YouTube later or listen to it from this thing. Some of them have told me they sit with a note paper and they print out the handout that you guys have, and they open their Bible and they're studying along with what I'm dealing with. And some of them, I think, are doing it in even more detail than we are doing, in the sense that they're trying to figure it out as I'm teaching on it, and they're listening and watching. And if I just kind of do an overview, then they're going to be disappointed. I sat here for an hour watching that video, and he didn't answer the questions I wanted answered. So anyway, I'm going to take the time to do it. Part of what impressed me on this, that others are doing that, is on our road trip, we attended church at a Landmark Baptist Church in Moore, Oklahoma, just south of Oklahoma City. And I preached for them, and a really good group of people. Howdy, when you watch this. And it just blew me away. I didn't know this, but the pastor, Brandon Tetford, he said, yeah, every Sunday evening service, we put you up on the screen, and our church sits there in our dining hall with our notebooks and Bibles, and we're studying it together, and then you get through with yours, and we sit and discuss it among ourselves. That just blew me away, that the whole church does that on a Sunday evening service. So I think they were on like session 12 when we were there, so they're probably up to about 15 or 16 or something now. So they'll catch up to me pretty quick. Maybe in a month or two, a couple of months, they'll catch up. And then they may have to do something else every other Sunday night. So that was something. to here. 25:14, the parable of the talents, is the judgment of individuals. So he's dealt with the marriage issue in the parable of the 10 virgins. He's going to deal with the nations in the sheep and the goats. But he wants them to know there is going to be a personal judgment for children of God. Because I think most of us believe, and I teach, that certainly all the lost will not be judged and raised until the end of the 1,000 years, the great white throne judgment. Now, there's a debate as to will there be saved people at the great white throne or not, or are all they resurrected at Jesus' return, and then there's a separation made in some way, and we may get into that some. But it's a judgment of individuals. Let's read through it quickly. The kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country who called his own servants, delivered his goods to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his own ability. Immediately he went on a journey. So I'm going to stop there, make some comments before I read it a little bit more. First of all, this idea of a judgment of individuals that this is going to deal with as we go through this parable is clearly taught in the scripture, isn't it? Let's just look at a few scriptures. There's quite a few of them. But in Romans chapter 14, verses 10 through 12, why do you judge your brother? Why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall confess to God. So then each of us shall give account of himself to God. So that's a really important doctrine or teaching to understand, that whatever the bride is made up of as a group, whatever the nations are made up as a group, apart from that, there's going to be a personal, individual judgment of our life. And that will be at the beginning of the millennial. It will be of children of God, at least. In 2 Corinthians 5 and 10, verse 9 says, therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. So that should be the goal of every child of God, is to be well-pleasing to the one who saved us, loved us, washed us from our sins. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one, there's that individual idea again, may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. And the parable of the talents deals somewhat with that. It says it's like a man traveling to a far country. In that day of travel, it would be right to conclude that if the owner came to his workers or to the farm laborers or whatever parable setting we have, the servants would know he's going to be gone for a long time. If he said, I'm going to go off to a far country, say he said India or Pakistan or whatever he said, Italy or Greece, and he's in Israel, they would know he's not going to come back for a long time. So right away, again, this is just one of those building blocks of no imminence. There's no idea of imminence here. You can't conclude he could come back tomorrow. Well, I guess if his wagon broke down or something, but in general, if he's going to a far country, it's going to take a long time. And that's exactly what verse 19 says. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So you put those two verses together, and it's difficult to conclude what the majority or a large percentage of Bible students teach the imminent return of Christ, that he could have come back at any time after he left and not violated one prophecy. But this at least implies, if not directly teaches, that it's not going to be right away. It's going to be a long time. And he called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. So this is language of what? Children of God, at least. Servants. This is not language of lost and saved, is what I'm trying to say. And it is interesting that of all the different, even very conservative commentators, really work hard to make this lost and saved, heaven or hell. And it just doesn't seem to fit at all. They belong to him. He is their owner, and he gives to them that which belongs to him. So unless, a number of commentators I looked up just so I could be aware of what's out there, tried to make this very generic or very general, God over his creation, and that he has given humans abilities and a free will, and he's just given them things, and he expects a return from them. That's too broad, I think, application of this parable. I think it's more narrow or limited than that. It is to those who have been his servants and who he decides it's okay to give his goods to them. Another reason I can't make this the issue of salvation of lost and saved is verse 15. To one he gave 5, another 2, another 1. Well, there are no degrees of salvation, is there? Salvation is salvation. It requires the same blood of Christ, requires the same faith, the same repentance, the same grace and forgiveness. This is speaking about him deciding among his servants, this one can handle this much, this one can handle that much, this one not so much, I'll just give them 1. He already this servant probably already had kind of a reputation before this for him to just say, maybe 1 is about all he can handle. So he had kind of a history, I think. To each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Now, ability, that's the thing about parables. You have to be a little bit careful, don't you? Because we know that God knows what abilities and gifts and skills and capacities that we have. But we're not to see ourselves as a better servant because I have more training, more abilities, more skills. I know the Bible says, to whom much is given, much is required. Don't many of you be teachers, knowing you'll receive a stricter judgment? But we should not see our service to Christ as my abilities. We should see our service to Christ as it's totally by my surrender to him and recognizing I don't have really anything of value to offer him. If he sees something, that's up to him. But whatever I do is by his grace, by his mercy. And so, it's not like he says, this one is going to be just wonderful because he has so much going for him. Sometimes the Lord can work within that. I've seen it. Sometimes that works against the person because that feeds into their pride. And so it's all by God's grace when you reach the bottom line of it. Immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them, made another 5 talents. Likewise, he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. So they each doubled. He had received one, went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. I heard a preacher say one time, and it's kind of always stuck with me about this in verse 18, the servant. He said, this man, he had to think about what to do with his talent. So he took some time. He had to go find a place that he could retrieve it later. He had to dig a hole. He had to bury the hole. And then knowing later he'd have to dig up that hole again and rebury it for that one talent. He said, some people work harder at not serving the Lord than they do just serving him. It's not a bad application of that. This guy actually went to quite a bit of effort to not do anything with his talent. And I guess a lot could be said about the difference between truly serving Christ or just being religiously busy. And I think a lot of churches, probably a lot of pastors, just our flesh nature, we have this tendency to think if we're just busy in religious things, that's the same as serving Christ. Well, it might be and it might not be. Yeah, depends on a lot of things. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you have delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I have gained 5 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. There's stewardship involved in our service to Christ, isn't there? He's made us stewards over his vineyard, over his talents, over his work, over his mission. And faithfulness is involved. And the heart of this parable is about faithfulness, isn't it? There's a lot involved in faithfulness. Only the Lord can judge if we're truly faithful. Only he really knows. We look at the outward appearance and we see somebody who's busy in their religion and we think they're being faithful to the Lord. Well, they might not be. No one was busier in religion than the Pharisees. They were busy all the time in their religion. And yet they received the greatest rebuke for having the outside of their dish clean, but not the inside. The inside of their cup was dirty. And so this serving the Lord thing that's why it requires such an honest heart, requires humility, requires a lot of self-reflection, requires a lot of prayer, meditation, reading the Word and just thinking about it. Because there's just something about our human nature that we easily impress ourselves. And especially if we're in a church that we hold some offices, people say nice things about us. We're kind of an important member, that kind of a thing. Then we can kind of let that be our self-identity as being a good Christian, a good servant, a faithful servant. And there are, Jesus did say, by their fruit you shall know them. So there is some fruit and evidence to look for. There is some outward evidence of a truly servant's heart. But faithfulness is something that is so much deeper than that, so much more intimate than that. Than just one man wrote one time, he said, religious doings may not impress God. And that's the fact, isn't it? Religious doings might not impress God. So this man was told by his Lord, well done, good and faithful servant. Wouldn't you want that Nothing else. If nothing else in the judgment day, if the Lord looked at you and said, well done, good and faithful servant, isn't that the ultimate desire that every one of us have? Is that he could truly say that. Well done, good and faithful servant. Others might be saying it about me, but the Lord may not be saying it about me. I may be saying that about me, but the Lord may not be saying that about me. So the only thing that matters is, will the Lord say that about me? When I'm standing looking at him, will he say, well done, good and faithful servant? Boy, I can't think of better words to hear. Because if you hear those words, then you're going to be among those 5 wise virgins in the first parable, aren't you? Enter into the joy of the Lord. So if this is said to you, then you enter the kingdom age, the millennial reign of Christ, the 1,000 years is going to be a single experience called the joy of the Lord. It's going to be the one phrase that describes your experience for 1,000 years. I mean, if we really start thinking about these things, it puts a lot more perspective in how we spend our time and money and energy and what we think about and what we expose ourselves to. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He also received 2 talents, came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents besides them. Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. The Lord knows all about us. He knows if we can handle 5 talents or 2 talents or 1 talent. All he asks in each case is be faithful with what I've given you. He doesn't expect the person with 1 talent to be able to come back with 10 talents. But he does expect them to come back with 2. As little as they had, they doubled it. That's great. 2 came back with, just each one of these. 2 came back with 4, and 5 came back with 10. I think one thing we can get from this parable as we read about this last one, then he who received the 1 talent, verse 24, came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man. Well, he can be, can he? I mean, the Lord expects a lot from his servants. He gives the grace and the help and the strength and the encouragement and the knowledge from his word and other good people to work beside us so that we're not all alone. He gives us a lot of help, but he still expects a lot. Reaping where you've not sown, gathering where you've not scattered seed. And I was afraid. I really think I've been guilty of it, so I know it to be true. I've heard plenty of others say that my service to Christ at times has been motivated mostly by fear. That's not always bad, because sometimes when my heart's not right with God and my love is not up to where it should be, and my desire is not where it should be, and my heart is not where it should be, fear still keeps me in line to some degree. So that's not that bad. I mean, those of us growing up, we know there were times with our parents that the fear of what we would face for disobedience was often enough to keep us in line. But we as parents then understand with our own children, but I don't want that to be the basis of our relationship. I want it to be based on love and respect and honor and noble things, not just fear of punishment. But fear does have a place in our Christian life. It just should not be the prominent place. Love should be the prominent place. I was afraid, went and hid your talent in the ground, and look, there you have what it is. So I had to go back, remember where it was, dig the hole again, find it, get it out, fill that hole back up. But he's still called a wicked and lazy servant, because I think the idea of what the one with 5 and the one with 2 did, it was an ongoing building of what the Lord had given them. Where this one who went and hid it, it's like, okay, that took whatever time it took, but then the rest, I'm not doing anything with it. I don't have it. So he could be called a wicked and lazy servant because he took the easy way out. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, gather where I have not scattered seed. You ought to have deposited my money with the bankers. At my coming, I would have received back my own with interest. Depending on which Bible dictionary or what source you look at, a talent is a lot of money. Have you ever looked it up?
$935.
$935? Is that what it says? What's that?
Mine says bag of gold.
Bag of gold?
Mine says 1900.
Yes, that's what I say. You look it up and you're going to find all kinds of answers. But a talent was a lot of money. A denarius that's used in other stories in the Gospels is 1 day's wage. A talent, depending on who you follow after, is at least a full year's wage. Some say several years. But let's just do 1 day versus 1 year. So it's a lot of money. He was given 5, and he gained 5 more. To whom much is given, much is required. I quoted earlier. This gain, and I put up on the board this idea of gain and loss, which is what I think this parable is about. I don't think it's about heaven and hell, lost or saved. I think it's about gain and loss for the child of God. He's talking directly to his disciples, letting them know each one of you are going to be judged individually, and you might gain and you might lose. This idea of gain or loss is it's a fascinating subject, because there's just this tendency in the Christian world, even in those who teach true salvation, that they'll read passages like this. They'll read passages, why don't we go over to 1 Corinthians 3, and a very familiar passage there. And they'll acknowledge that these passages exist and then kind of explain it away by saying, yeah, there'll be kind of a difference of rewards. But the Bible makes it a much bigger deal than that, whether I, get 1 gift or 2 gifts. The Bible teaches that a child of God can lose everything other than their salvation. They cannot lose that. That is a birth. That is a new life. That is eternal. Our spirit is made perfect and sinless, and it will never change. But I don't know what you'd do with this passage in 1 Corinthians 3 if you then, normally what I hear even by pretty conservative Bible teachers is that, yeah, there is a difference of rewards, but every child of God's going to be in the bride. Isn't that a little bit contradictory? Especially when you look at passages that makes the difference of rewards quite substantial, not just a little bit. So, verse 10, 1 Corinthians 3, according to the grace of God which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, another builds on it, but take heed, let each take heed how he builds on it. No other foundation can anyone lay that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. So there's the foundation. And it's clear he's talking about what do you build on top of that foundation. The foundation's always going to be there. Christ will always be there. If anyone builds on this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, or wood, hay, and straw. Obviously, two different groups of building materials. Each one's work, there's that individual idea again. Each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it. Well, that's what this parable of the talents is dealing with in parable form. Because it will be revealed by fire, the fire of judgment, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. Well, if you look back at those building materials in verse 12, even a young child understands one group of those is very easily burned up by fire, and the other group is not easily burned up by fire. So fire has a great effect on one, but not so much on the other. Verse 14, here's the gain I have up here on the board, 1 Corinthians 3:14. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, why does it endure? Because it's gold, silver, precious stones. He will receive a reward. 5 talents, 2 talents. If anyone's work is burned, but he still has the foundation, he still has Christ, he still has his salvation experience, he will suffer loss. I mean, that many people I listen to and read after, it's as if that verse should not be in the Bible, but it is in the Bible. You got to do something with it. But in many people's minds, it's, forgive me, equity idea. I know that's used in different ways in our country today. This equity idea of equal outcomes is a really common teaching in Christian type churches. And as long as you're a child of God, no matter how you live, no matter what you do with what's been given to you, an equal outcome that the Bible calls the bride of Christ. That's for every child of God. Well, this verse seems to teach quite the opposite, that a person whose works are burned up will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. So you have, in verse 15, you have both eternal security of the believer and the idea of great loss for a child of God who builds with materials that are not godly, that are not lasting, that are not permanent. Verse 3:15 is a powerful verse that undercuts a lot of what I hear being taught these days. And then in, what else do I have? 2 John verse 8. I put those down below in blue because they kind of deal with both loss and gain. So 2 John verse 8, look to yourselves that we do not lose those things we worked for, but that we may receive a full reward. So there is a reward, there is a full reward, there is a loss. We can lose those things. So there's a loss and a gain that will come out in the judgment. And another verse, there's many verses like this. I just picked out a few of them. Revelation 3:11. Behold, I am coming quickly. Hold fast or firm what you have, that no one may take your crown. That's it. That's really fascinating, isn't it? How can someone take my crown? Well, a lot of ways. An unfaithful shepherd, a pastor. If I follow him, if I accept his teachings, if I accept his way of life, and he's an unfaithful pastor, he's not a good shepherd, I'm letting him take my crown. A mate, a child, a close friend, fellow church member, we can really kind of turn over our eternal rewards to other people if we're not careful. And that tells me that even though I am to serve the Lord with other people in a church setting, I still, in the end, have this personal responsibility to take care of my own Christian life. As he said to one of the 7 churches, you have a few names in Sardis who have not defiled their garments. That tells me the rest of the church has. But there were a few people that had enough in them and about them that they were able to say, I'm not going to let them take my crown. They can lose their crown if they want, but I don't want to lose my crown. We got to get back and deal with outer darkness in this parable. Here's the part that seems very unfair. This whole attitude that's even crept into Christian type churches of equity really has a hard time with this and probably wishes this was not in the Bible. Verse 28, so take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. Why not give it to the one that has 4? He gave it to the one that had the most already. That just seems very unfair. One thing we can say for sure about the judgment of God, it will be fair, but it will be strict. It will be done. Every person will get exactly what is right. Exactly. Now, all this is building a case in my mind that, he says in verse 29, everyone who has more will be given. He will have abundance, but from him who does not have even what he has will be taken away. Well, I know no socialist likes this verse. Talk about anti-socialism, just in principle, much less in serving God. But this is how God's going to deal with people. So, people come along and say, well, if Jesus was here, he'd be a communist, he'd be a socialist because he just loves everybody the same. Well, he might love everybody the same in a sense he died for everyone equally, but the judgment day is going to be based on a lot of factors that is summarized by the one word, faithfulness. In all of its meanings, faithfulness. And cast the unprofitable servant. See, I can't make this a lost person, but even by many of my own brethren, some of my own brethren, it's been declared heresy to say that this is a saved person because outer darkness must be hell. Well, it must not. It doesn't have to be. Cast the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. I think it was Albert Runyon, or this was attributed to him, and it sounds like the kind of thing he'd say. Someone asked him what he believed about outer darkness, and he said something like, I'm teaching unprofitable servant can be cast into outer darkness. They're really shocked by it. He says, it says outer darkness, not utter darkness. That's a pretty good answer. Hell is utter darkness. This is outer darkness. I think there's something to that. I think that needs to be considered as a real possibility. The term outer darkness, the exact term outer darkness, is only used 3 times, and they're all in Matthew. So, some people make a really big deal out of it, make it a major doctrine, a test of fellowship, the declaration of heresy, all sorts of things. But it's only used 3 times in only 1 book. And the first time is in chapter 8, verse 12. You might want to write these down and just remember them. 8:12 says, but the sons of the kingdom, the idea of sons in the Bible usually means inheritance, those who are in a place that they should inherit. The sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, based on what we read in 1 Corinthians 3:15, he shall suffer loss. All of his works are burned up. He shall suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as by fire. Do you think that person will have regret? Isn't that weeping and gnashing of teeth just another way of saying there's going to be some regret among children of God? Glad that they have the gift of salvation and that can never be lost, but they stand before the Lord and they see all their life burned up. And they see these other people receiving 10 talents or whatever. We have this odd idea about in the judgment day or even in the millennial, there's going to be no regret of any type. I could just waste my Christian life, do nothing with it, never grow, never be a witness, or never seek the truth, none of that, and expect my experience during the millennial to be enter into the joy of the Lord. Well, the Lord could not say that to that servant. He could not say enter into the joy of the Lord because there's going to be regret mixed in. The other time that outer darkness is mentioned is in 22:13. And I recognize this is kind of a difficult one, that man that did not have on the wedding garment. In 22:13, the king said to the servants, bind him hand and foot, take him away, cast him at outer darkness, there'll be weeping, gnashing of teeth. But it is, at least in a wedding or a marriage setting, a ceremony of a marriage of the man's son to his bride. So again, it's not really in the context of heaven and hell, lost or saved. Many people make it so, but that's fine. And then this one here is the third one. Turn to 1 John chapter 2 with me. I want to maybe explain it a little bit this way. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 9. Now, 9 through 11. Now, you notice in these three short verses, the term his brother is mentioned in each verse. So 3 times, his brother. Especially in John's writing, he would not be describing this person as a brother toward each other, his brother, unless they were on a spiritual setting with each other, condition of at least a child of God with each other. He who says he is in the light and hates his brother is in darkness until now. He who loves his brother abides in the light. There is no cause for stumbling in him. But he who hates his brother is in darkness and walks in darkness, does not know where he's going because the darkness has blinded his eyes. So a brother in Christ can walk in darkness his whole Christian life because he has a lot of hatred and animosity toward his other brothers and sisters. But expect in the judgment day for the Lord to say, enter into the joy of the Lord and have everything you want, enjoy all the blessings that I have for you. I remember as a young boy, Art Harris preaching for us one time at airport, and he said something along the line of, what is eternal life? He said, doesn't eternal life not just mean the extent out there, non-ending, but he said, when does eternal life begin? Well, it begins the moment you trust Christ. He said, from that moment on, you are in eternal life. It's not just after you die. From that moment on, you are living in eternal life. So he said, what happens after you die is just an extension of how you lived. So I would take this subject to say, if you walked in darkness your Christian life, why would you think there would not be some sort of something called darkness as part of your eternal experience? Because it's just a continuation of how you chose to walk here. If you walk in the light here, you will certainly walk in the light, the joy of the Lord there. The people of this day, Bible day, they all lived in walled cities. they would easily understand it refers to being cast outside the walls of a walled city. And that was, a lot of times, that was that you would remain a citizen. If you were part of that city, you were citizens of that city. One of the punishments, if you broke the law or, whatever, is you would be sentenced to a certain amount of time outside the walls of the city. So you don't have the provisions of inside, you don't have the protections of the inside, but you're still considered a citizen. You're not told to go off to another country. You just have to camp outside the city, which has less light, less benefits of different types. That was just a concept they understood naturally, because that was just a daily experience for them. So it's not describing heaven or hell. One reason, again, I say this is because when he calls it outer darkness in verse 30, if he meant hell, as he continues his sermon in verse 41, to those people, he says, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels." It's almost like he's purposely using two different terminologies, because if they were the same, if the outer darkness was the same as hell, seems to me he would use that same terminology of verse 41 in verse 30. Why does he use two different terms in the same sermon if he's talking about the same place? I think this servant, that the talent was taken from him, could have heard. He could have heard. Based on verse 27, "You ought to have deposited my money with the bankers at my coming. I would have received back my own with interest. If you had done that, I would have received you well." So it could have happened. That man could have heard, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I think in context, I can't reach any other conclusion. But because he did not do anything with what he was given, it was taken from him. I think this is just a continuation idea of chapter 24 and verse 51. That chapter closes with the faithful servant and the evil servant, and the master delays his coming, begins to beat his fellow servants, eat and drink with the drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, an hour he is not aware of, will cut him in two, appoint his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And in that context, I think it's talking about even like pastors or ministers, those with responsibility to feed God's people, attacking and hurting each other. They will be, I think, among those who will experience weeping and gnashing of teeth. I think I will stop there. That will be enough evidence and ammunition for people who watch this to use against me. So I think